Hey guys, Matt Gurney here, Jen Gerson with me. The latest episode of the Line podcast starts right now. It is November the 8th, 2024. And oh my God.
This episode of The Line has been brought to you by Unsmoke Canada. Canada can be a global leader in reducing the harm caused by smoking, but it requires actionable steps, including giving adult smokers the information they need to choose potentially less harmful alternatives. Learn more at unsmoke.ca.
Sorry, that was maybe a little more of a blunt introduction than normal. Jen was able to get her giggles under control while we ran the musical interlude there. So, Jen, welcome home.
Yeah, thanks for having me home. Really appreciated being able to get back into the country. I will admit that I have not fully recovered from my trip to Israel, either from a sheer physical perspective or from an emotional perspective. I am almost finished writing what I have a feature, sort of a magazine-length feature, based on what I experienced there. But every time I sit down to write it, my children or my emotions get the best of me, and I've been procrastinating a little bit. So that is coming. I'm hoping it's going to come today or tomorrow, but I'm hoping for a weekend read style piece on that one. Also, the other thing that really swept up my attention away from my writing was The Thing.
Why, did anything happen this week?
There was a thing. Would you like to talk about some stuff going on? Matt, you want to talk about The Thing?
No. No, I sure don't.
Well, just let's continue to talk about the internecine virtues of parliamentary democracy in Canada. Then let's just completely ignore it, pretend like it didn't happen.
Yeah. Okay. Here, I'm just adjusting my camera here. There we go. It's better.
So there was some news in Ottawa.
So here,
should we just have the rest of this podcast just us staring off into a wall and then just emoting with our faces?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, that's enough.
Yeah, but we could do that for another hour.
We could do that for another hour and be better off for it. Okay, so
better is always possible. So let's bring the bar.
Possible.
Yeah.
So we published earlier in the week our quick reaction, our first takes on the U.S. election, and I think they've held up. As in terms of more numbers becoming clearer. Now, a very smart, strapping young man wrote a piece for us that we published on Friday. And Jen, I believe you have some familiarity with the gentleman. He's your husband. We do disclose that in the piece. But your husband's also a pollster. And he had the opportunity and also, I would say, the accessibility to grab some of the raw data, stuff that's not always easily available to you and I. And he has begun to piece together a story in numbers. Well, we'll call it something as I know it sounds a little highfalutin, but literally, here are the votes. Here's where they were moving. Here's where they were the same. And I think everything that you and I had written about on Wednesday, the day after the vote, holds up. We're seeing a little bit more evidence for some of the trends, but I think we were basically right. What we promised people to do on Wednesday was to kind of come up with the big thinky, what it all means reaction in time for the weekend. And oh my God, we might have overpromised on that front. I'm not convinced yet that I can deliver. I think some narratives are forming and some ideas are shaping up. But in terms of what it all means, I'm still my wife has caught me a couple times this week staring off into space, like you were joking a minute ago. And I don't want listeners or viewers to misunderstand me. It's not that I'm upset or depressed. I am upset about something, and I'll tell people about that, what it is. But what happens to me, and it's kind of a personality quirk, is I get lost in thought. And where it's like my brain is turning over stuff, and I'll be in a room with someone, but like 99.9% of my brain power shifts inside. And then my wife would be like, "Hey, Matt. And I was, what? Oh, yeah, sorry." And she's like, "Please pass the orange juice." Oh, yeah, okay. That's happened to me like a half dozen times this week. Do you want to? I mean, Jen, we kind of set aside this first segment for vibe check. Do you want to start with the intellectual stuff, or do you want to start with the emotional stuff?
I want to start with this one, and I don't know if it's intellectual or emotional or both, but Matt, you and I have both worked in various newsrooms and some overlapping newsrooms, and it will shock no one to know that in newsrooms, particularly when you're working on the editorial side, which is usually or traditionally quite distinct from the news gathering side, like they're kind of related but separate kingdoms within a newsroom. And I've worked on both sides of it, and I believe you've worked on the editorial side of it for a very long time. But it's very common for newspapers to have a kind of editorial position, an editorial worldview. I'm sure there's a German word for this, but a way of framing and looking at the world and using that as an organizing principle for what kinds of stories get priority and which kind of stories don't get priority. And it's a kind of a group collective thing that happens in a newsroom that creates that overview and that worldview. And it's complicated, and it's usually not as sinister nor as conspiratorial as a lot of people from outside the newsroom would think it is. But there is a way of looking at the world. And sometimes that worldview has a tendency to lock particularly the editorial, not the news gathering, but particularly the editorial side of an organization into positions on complicated subjects to such an extent that certain positions are reduced to heuristics. It's a $10 word I don't mean to use, but I don't know a better one. But one of the ways that you kind of cope with that when you're on the editorial side is to turn these kind of heuristics into pithy phrases that you recite to yourself over and over again, quasi-ironically. I'm not going to name particular names, but one of these pithy phrases that kept on jumping to mind as I was watching the American results roll in was, America has the right to decide its own destiny. America has the right to decide its own destiny, which kind of has the effect of operating like a thought-terminating cliche that divorces me from any emotions that the outcomes may produce. Because I'm not an American, neither are you. We don't work for an American outlet. We can't speak to what this says about America, nor can we speak to what the American worldview or mindset was that led them to make this choice. I mean, we're very much outsiders observing from the outside here. And America does have the right to decide its own destiny. However, that decision has knock-on effects for a lot of people who are outside of the American orbit, ourselves included. And I think that this decision is going to have very significant knock-on effects for countries like Canada, to such an extent that I don't think it's too much to say that it feels very much like we've passed a veil of history. We're going to, in the future, recognize what happened prior to the second Trump presidency as being very distinct from what happens after the Trump presidency. I think, all of the trend lines for where we were going historically were in place 10 years ago, but this is going to feel like a very definitive moment in time. It's going to feel like a very definitive shift in hindsight. I think it's going to mark a new era in terms of how America sees itself. And I think it's going to mark a new era in terms of America's relationship with its allies and its enemies. For a long time, people have been saying that we were moving more toward a 19th century style great power block geopolitical realignment, which again sounds overly fancy, but it's really not. It just means that it's a bit of a reversion away from the global world order of things, or seeing the globe as being a highly globalized organization that could be managed by supranational entities like the UN. I think there's an abandonment of that idea. And
UN,
reverting,
WTO, things like that, yeah.
Yeah, and instead what I think what we're seeing is going to be an American retrenchment and a retrenchment into a great power block kind of dynamic. And a second Trump victory cements that end. It cements the beginning of that era, I think, for all of us. So that's I said, it's hard for me to have feelings about that. How do you have feelings about great eras in history or momentous ambitions in history coming to an end and the beginning of a new thing? I mean, future scholars are going to argue about whether or not this moment began in 2008 or 2016 or 2024. But I do feel like now is the moment where it's actually definitive. Everyone will have come to an agreement that by 2024, the new thing has started. So it's a weird moment to live through. And it's weird to have personal feelings about it. because it's not personal. It's the opposite of personal. It's supra-personal, right? But it's also weird to live through an era in history that you recognize as an era in history when you're in it, as opposed to recognizing it in hindsight. But that's what it feels like to me.
It's funny. So Jen and I have been unusually run ragged this week, and I'm breaking the fourth wall here. I'm just talking right to the viewers and the listeners. Jen and I, you and I have barely spoken this week, and it's just normally we would speak more, but we've been so busy this week that any conversation we've had has been either brief or totally consumed by something else. We actually haven't really kicked these ideas around. But what you're describing is almost exactly what I've been thinking. And even to the point where you had mentioned historians will decide where one era transitioned to the other. I think I've decided it was 2008. And I don't mean that as a calendar date, but the events of 2008, the global economic crisis, the increasing weariness of the American population with the burdens of being the world's policeman in Afghanistan and Iraq, the devastation of the U.S. economy that a lot of people still haven't recovered from economically, families haven't recovered from. And I think we lived through a period of kind of where maybe history could have gone one way or the other. And one of the things that's just absolutely fascinating to me, and I'm going to piss people off when I say this, but I actually mean this in a completely objective way. One of the issues that needed to be determined by only the process, like the unfolding of linear time, was whether or not Donald Trump was the future or a loser who had a fluke win. And we didn't really know that. And people have very strong feelings on Trump for and against, so I'm going to piss everybody off here. But let's just look at the record. 2016 was a legitimate win for Mr. Trump, but it was a weird one. Very small number of votes in very few states. And that ended up kind of like, it was almost like a lucky roll of the dice. And your husband, who has better knowledge of this, could speak more to that. But it was one of the weirdest ways to win a presidential election. And then Trump lost the midterms, and he lost 2020. And that suggested that history was returning to a pre-08 trajectory, that there had been an anger and a reactionary backlash, and Trump was a big bombastic personality who was the fluky outcome of that.
The echo of an older time. Yeah, the echo of an older time that was having a spasm in modern history. Sure, you could tell.
The other possibility was always that that in fact we have cleaved onto a new historical track, and that everything between Tuesday or Wednesday morning, if you prefer, and 2008 was the mopping up period of sort of chaos and disentanglement. If it had been a really fluky election either way, Harris pulls it off by like one electoral vote based on 10 Philadelphians, or another weird fluke roll of the dice, loses for Trump, loses the popular vote, but breaks the blue wall in enough places to get the electoral college. I think we could have said, well, we still don't know. Jury's still out. But that's not what happened.
Right.
And this is why in our Wednesday dispatch, like the point you and I co-wrote that, but the point I hammered over and over and over was that this is a decisive Trump win. And to my mind, that settles the question of which path we're on historically. Now, nothing lasts forever.
All historical eras end, but yeah. So
and sort of what I'm going to call, this is lazy, and I don't we'll have to come up with a better term for it, but the Trump era, right? We'll come up with a better term for it eventually, but for now, the Trump era could be 10 years. It could end at the end of this term, right? And it'll be the 12-year span between his first election and the end of his second term. It could be 50 years. Could be 100.
I don't
know.
Yeah.
Well, you said before it's hard to have feelings.
The only thing I would just say, just adding to the historical point, the other hypothetical start date for this era could be actually 2001 and September 11th, 9/11. So I would say 9/11, 2008, 2016, 2014. I think there could be arguments for this, but the point is, there's a definitive break here between some point in this period in the last generation. There's been a definitive break from this and what came before, which was, roughly 70 to 100 odd years of increasing global intertanglement, increasing globalization, increasing global cooperation, peace, and prosperity. So that's over now.
I agree. And I mentioned before that I've been thinking about this week. I did think a lot about 9/11.
Yeah.
The reason ultimately I came down on '08 instead of 2001 is I think, again, there were opportunities after '01 where things could have gone one way or the other. I also think '01 might have had a rally around the flag effect that brought Americans together in a way that might have postponed some of what we're dealing with now. But by '08, it was destroyed.
Well, and then the other thing I would say, and I would say this is a direct lead into the Trump, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, Matt, but it's a direct lead into Trump's victory in hindsight, both in 2016 and I think today, is that if you listen to a lot of the Americans who are pro-Trump talk about why they're pro-Trump, the thing that comes up really consistently is Trump is anti-war.
Yeah.
I'm tired of my loved ones. I'm tired of being sent off to war. My cousins, my brothers, my blah, 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 were traumatized from Iraq, Afghanistan, all these places. We're done. We don't want to do this anymore. We don't want to play world police anymore. I don't want my sons to be sent to war over some, war in a place that I can't name on a map. They're not interested in being this anymore. And I thought that it was very interesting, and it's something that has been repeatedly missed in American media, how much of Trump's victory seems to be rooted in this idea that Trump is not going to send my son to war.
You said a minute ago that it's hard to have feelings about this, that it's almost supra-personal, and I thought that was an elegant way of putting it. But I actually am going to disagree with you, and I think you're going to know what I mean when I say this. I think it's actually extremely easy to have feelings about this. The problem that people like you and I have, who are very Vulcan left-brained, is that we're not good at having feelings. And when we have feelings, we tell them to go away. And that's not the same thing as not having them. It's just being bad at having them. Mm. And I've kind of gone through a cycle of feelings this week. The funny thing is, too, people who will know me through my work in Canada have correctly identified me as right-wing. And a lot of people don't understand why I loathe Trump the way I do. And I've been thinking about it this week. I think what I've come up with, it's strange the way the mind works, but what I've been thinking about this week, Jen, is you'll remember this. Back in the 2016 campaign, Donald Trump mocked a reporter who had a disfigured arm. Trump denied this later and said, I didn't do that. Well, he was full of shit.
It's on video.
It was on video. And also he said, I didn't even know the reporter. I didn't know that his arm was like that. The reporter had the receipts that he had met Trump a number of times over the years and had interviewed him back when he was a Manhattan real estate mogul many times. So this is all full of shit. But the reporter had a birth condition that resulted in his right arm being severely underdeveloped, very shriveled and small, and also the joint sort of locked. So I don't mean to mock him, but this is sort of how he carries his arm, because his shoulder, his elbow, his wrist are locked, and his arm is underdeveloped, no musculature. And at a press one of his rallies in front of a huge number of people, Trump was going, and making fun of the reporter. And people are going to have 1,000, a million, a billion different reasons for not liking Mr. Trump. To me, that's the one that sort of made all the other ones unnecessary. A lot of Trump policy I agreed with. A lot of Trump policy I disagreed with. I was trying to call the balls and strikes fairly during the Trump one. But what I can never get over is the fact that if someone in my personal life mocked someone who has endured a life of hardship because they were born with a physical disability, and if they mocked that person, I would conclude that that person was an asshole. And I wouldn't want anything to do with them. And to me, I'm pretty absolutist about these things. I've got a stick up my ass. More than one person has known that before. I'm kind of a moral purist on stuff. Not a Puritan, but, I make moral decisions about people. And Donald Trump failed a pretty basic moral test for me 8 years ago. And then he's done a lot of things since that I also didn't like. But fundamentally, I was trying to figure out why I was feeling these big feels this week. And what I fundamentally concluded is that it offends my sense of justice, moral justice, that a man who got up, a powerful, rich, wealthy man, got up before a crowd and mocked someone who has overcome remarkable personal adversity through an accident of birth. And he mocked him. And people loved it. And I could rationalize the first one as a fluke. I can't do that anymore. Somewhere in the vicinity of 75, probably, the votes are still being counted. When it's all said and done, 75 million Americans who had no excuse to not know what Mr. Trump is like looked at that and said, I'm okay with it. And I'm not saying they embraced it, but I'm saying they were okay with it. And something I just find incredible over the last few days, and even the last 8 years. Jen, everybody's got their reason. Everybody has something they will admit to not liking about Mr. Trump, and everybody has something they will then acknowledge they support him anyway. I don't like that he did this, but he's going to be good for this. Okay. You said a minute ago, Jen, that America has a right to choose its own destiny. Every human individual has a right to choose for themselves what matters to them. But people this week have been, in a matter of casual conversation, have been confessing to me what their price was. Yeah, I don't like that Trump did this, but he's going to be great at that. Okay, so that was your price. That is the price that you accepted in payment for being okay with the guy who made fun of the reporter with the shriveled hair. And okay, I kind of feel like I did early after October 7th when people are coming out with pretty wild takes on Israel, the Middle East and stuff. And I adopted, Jen, the policy of I was going to accept everyone at their word. Wasn't going to argue. Wasn't going to try and change their minds. I was just going to go, okay. But it offends my sense of justice. My price is higher than that.
So I've got
been disappointing.
2 points. I've got 2 points on what you were saying right there. And again, I'm going to try not to get too unfeeling or too Vulcan-brained.
Every time you say that,
I fail. Okay, so here's the thing I would say is, and I wrote about this in our dispatch on Wednesday, so people who want a more articulate version of what I'm about to say can go back and what we wrote on Wednesday. I believe it's not paywalled. www.readtheline.ca. I do get the sense that a lot of the voting for Trump, despite his manifold moral and personal failings, which I think are indisputable to anybody who is not deluding themselves, it is a direct reaction to the last 10 years of what I would call woke politics. And people like Barry Weiss have made this comment and said, well, he's a reaction to woke politics, and the critics have critiqued Barry Weiss by saying, well, Kamala Harris didn't run on woke politics. And I'm like, that is a bit of a nonsense defense.
No, but she's carrying the bag for them.
Yeah,
she's the natural.
The idea that you
everything
can,
that came before.
Yeah, the idea that you can divorce the last 10 years of progressive politics from Kamala Harris because Kamala Harris didn't personally run on trans issues in the last 90-day campaign. I think that's insane. Right. That's totally insane.
Totally agree.
I think a lot of the reason why people are unwilling to factor in Trump's unfitness is because there has been a collapse of moral authority in what I broadly call the institutional left. So the leftish, left-leaning organizations of academia, media, courts, for lack of a better term, have lost their moral authority with the plurality of the population as a direct result of many of these institutions adopting a liberal politics as a central tenet of who and what they are. And as a result, when these institutions went and said, that man actually is a threat to democracy, that man is unfit, the end result was, and who are you? And who are you to tell me who's unfit?
Yeah.
Who the fuck do you think you are? I think that there's been a push-pull, and Trump is the direct response of the collapse of these institutions to maintain their own values and sense of self in the face of extraordinary social pressure. That's just my opinion.
No, I agree entirely.
I think that there's a moment for a lot of what I call, and I don't call it the woke left here, I'm calling it the institutional left. I understand there's always going to be an activist segment within any kind of political movement. I'm talking about the people who are actually established in institutions and consider themselves leftish. Your failure to identify the liberal, radical politics that took over your institutions,
clean your own house.
Failure to keep your house clean, your failure to identify and stand up for what role you actually serve in society has led to this. And I think that if you are in the institutional left or consider yourself the same, this should be a moment of realizing these assholes like Trump more than you. Consider that. Readjust. I think that this is a fair point to make. I don't know if you're going to make it, but I think it's a fair point to make. So my sense of that, there is the sense from the outside is that the election of Trump is a giant, we're done with this signal.
Yeah.
We're done.
Oh, yeah.
We're completely done with woke politics. We're completely done with all of these elements. We're done with the institutions that refuse to clean house as a result of them. We are completely
bad trade deals, being the world's policeman.
We're completely done with all of it. And I think that is the signal that I'm overwhelmingly getting from Americans. It's anger, it's frustration, it's a lot of pent-up grief from the last several decades. And they're taking on Trump as their avatar because he offends people like you, Matt. And I understand that. So, but here's the thing that I would say to those people. What you are going to see over the next 5+ years.
You haven't made your last compromise.
What you are going to see over the last 5+ years is a lot of people bending themselves into intellectual pretzels to justify increasingly inappropriate stances and policies that they would never imagine that they would stand up for today. So I would say if you are a Trump supporter, be honest with yourself enough to do a moral self-evaluation, identify where your moral lines are today. I would challenge you to write those lines, those hard lines down on paper, the hard lines at which any government of any kind, carve them into stone. What's the line at which an American president or his successors could pass at which they would lose you? Carve those into stone today, November 8th, 2024. These are the lines that I would not accept any president of any denomination, of any tribe passing. Okay? Make those really clear for yourself right now. All right? Put them on paper somewhere. Put them in a book somewhere. And come back to those hard lines in 3 years.
No one's going to do that.
I know.
And here's the problem. You have articulated it differently, but it's funny, you and I have arrived at identical conclusions. You've articulated it a bit differently. You've articulated it as a call to action. For me, I articulate it more as a warning. All of you out there have concerns about Trump. All of you out there might have some things you like about him. And some of you might come down on the side of, I don't like A, but he's going to be great at B. It's not going to stop at B, and it's not going to stop at A, because he's going to come up with really interesting, good policy on the regulatory front. He's going to do good things as president. He's also going to do appalling stuff. And you're going to be forced into trade after trade after trade after trade. Once you're on this train, it does not stop until it crashes. You're on it. He's going to say and do and propose or enable and tolerate stuff that you're going to find appalling.
Or that you would have found appalling right now.
Well, and that's it.
On that note, Matt, America has the right to decide its own destiny.
It does.
America has the right to decide. Yes, and then I do want to pivot to what we're talking, the Canadian side of this.
It's a weirdly self-indulgent thing to put on a podcast. I recognize the fact that I'm the problem. I wish, and I have wished many times before in my life, that I was better at being ruthlessly pragmatic. But I'm not. I'm just not wired that way. And in my professional life, in my personal life, I would have been more successful in both if I was better at the bad at A but good at B calculus. But I'm not. It's something that I am incapable of doing. And I wish I was capable of it, because it would be helpful and would have made other things hurt less in my personal life. The ability to go, well, yeah, it's this, but whatever, like I'll still get that. It is really interesting for me to be seeing today other people who are wired the same way that I am. And there's some of us out there, not many of us. I said a few days ago to a friend that one of the interesting things about this new political era is that people like me, at least for a while, are obsolete. The people who can't wheel and deal and make those hard-headed, pragmatic, moral compromises, they're not going to fare well. Remember we said a few minutes ago, time will tell if it's a 10-year period or a century. However long it lasts, people like me are not going to fare well if they're part of the system. People like me are going to have to learn to operate outside of it. And that's okay. I'm fine with that. I'm constitutionally equipped to do that. Boy, it's going to be lonely sometimes. And you said before that it's hard to feel the feelings. 99% of the time, I'm like you. I'm a Vulcan left brain. I'm just putting this one down now for all the other people out there, and there's not many of them, but there will be some, and some of them will hear this. You're not alone. You're just outnumbered.
America has the right to decide its own destiny. Like and subscribe The Line.
Readtheline.ca.
This episode of The Line has been brought to you by Unsmoke Canada, which is dedicated to helping Canadians who are looking to quit smoking understand the full range of options available. Despite decades of government programs and regulations, today nearly 5 million Canadians adults smoke cigarettes. Adult smokers who choose to continue to smoke should be aware that other options exist. Right now, accessing information about these options is heavily restricted in Canada. While not risk-free, alternatives such as heated tobacco and vaping products provide a potentially less harmful choice than cigarettes. Cigarettes burn tobacco, resulting in smoke that contains 6,000 harmful chemicals that are associated with smoking-related disease and death. Heating tobacco and vaping products have the potential to significantly reduce this risk. Health agencies around the world are now considering these alternatives to help end smoking. Updated laws can help adult smokers better understand the full range of options available, including the relative risk of these products. Millions of Canadians smoke cigarettes. Technology exists that can help change that, but policymakers need to take action. Learn about how a smoke-free future can be achieved at unsmoke.ca.
Matt, I want to talk about our wheelhouse, which is Canada. And I want to talk about what's going on in Amsterdam, because I think it has some saliency to what's happening here in Canada. But first, this is going to be a subject of, I think, several specific podcasts going forward, because I think this fundamentally changes Canada's place in the world, and it changes our relationship to America in a very fundamental and deep way, in a way that will not be undone anytime soon. I'm having a hard time articulating it because I think that it is such a broad conversation. But the first one is that
I described it, Jen. I think I know exactly what you mean. It feels like you're trying to sketch an object that's so big you can't see all of it at once.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that firstly, the first real change is that Canada and the people who operate in the geopolitical space in Canada are fundamentally going to have to come to terms with a failed theory of the geopolitical case, if that makes sense. If you're hearkening back to previous podcasts we've done, they had a theory of the world and how it worked, and they had been operating a diplomatic and trade-based strategy based on that theory. Yeah. And that theory is now proven false. So we are going to have to really radically reevaluate the theory of the case of the world around us and make some pretty pragmatic, hard-headed decisions about how we're going to go forward. And those pragmatic, hard-headed decisions are going to, or very likely to, tear apart the liberals, I think, because I think it's very much at odds with how the liberals see themselves and see the world around them. So they're going to have to...
brand.
Yeah. Hopey touchy-feely days are now well and truly behind us.
I'm not the only one who's obsolete now.
That's right. And the other two is the idea that we live in a pan-national world where we can be, good, seen as neutral Swiss-like actors between the West and the East. I mean, that theory has always fallen apart with history, and yet many aspects of the Canadian establishment cling to it.
So on patches of Canadian flags for backpacks, I think I'm bearish on those.
Yeah. We cannot avoid our relationship with the United States. We don't survive as a country. We don't survive economically unless we are on the best of terms with the United States, regardless of whether or not we like the president. That's just the reality. Our quality, if America closes its border or puts tariffs on our goods, our quality of life collapses. We are no longer a wealthy nation. We are no longer a G7 nation. We can no longer not pull our weight militarily or on defense. The expectations for that are about to radically change. We are going to have to spend significantly more money on blood and treasure abroad in support of our American allies. And I think that we're going to have to accept some very hard concessions from people that we don't like ideologically.
Canadian blood is going to pay for our market access to the United States.
Yep.
And that probably is going to be the best deal we can get. I'm not arguing against it. I'm just trying to put it in terms I think people should understand what's coming. Mm-hmm. Agree with you entirely. You and I are very much in sync today. I was thinking this morning, having my morning tea. I told you in the first segment, I keep getting lost in thought. I almost missed an appointment I had this morning because I was like staring into the mid-distance drinking tea. One of the things I was seeing this morning, and this is going to sound actually a weirdly cheerful comment to make, given kind of what we're talking about here. Canada actually did a really good job adapting itself to the world order as it was from like 1945 up to, as you and I have been saying, some to be determined point in the relatively recent past. We optimized ourselves very successfully. Like we really were able to build an environment where we as an economic and military mid-power were able to thrive and kind of get spoiled a bit. And I'm not trying to say that, those boomers, I don't mean it that way, but like we correctly interpreted the post-Second World War geopolitical environment. I would say especially sort of the last 40 years of globalization, free trade. We read the room correctly. We made smart decisions. We optimized a country that could maximize indulgences, butter over guns, right? We were really, really good at that. Our failure was not realizing that was ending. And you, in fairness to everybody, you and I are ourselves in this podcast, we're saying, hey, we only really kind of had our definitive answer this week. But the prudent thing to do in 16 or at least 20 would have been to ask ourselves some tough questions and hedge some bets. Not necessarily go all in, but what would we have been like a 50-50 chance we're returning to the same historical track or we're on a new one? What would be a prudent thing to do if it's the 50% that we're on a new one? We had opportunities to do that in 16 and 20, and we didn't. So all those bills come due at once now. Okay. That was a failure of planning and I think of understanding.
I think that we have squandered 10 years. We've squandered 10 years.
At least 5, possibly 10.
Yeah, doing some of the things that we needed to do to prepare for this moment as a nation. And I think that's going to eat us. I think that's going to be a real harsh adjustment. So
I used a term.
I think I think disabusing people of the fantasy of the world we lived in prior to 2001 is going to be a really hard wake-up call for many people, particularly in the progressive side of the line, but even for the conservative side of the line. I mean, conservatives, I don't think have a really good grasp of this.
Some of them, I think have a more open mind to it, but the Conservative Party of Canada today, and Pierre Poilievre in particular, are very much products of the globalization era, post-Second World War, international geopolitical structure.
That's right. So it's going to be, I think the only way to understand the era that we're going back to is to go back and read sort of pre-World War II history books.
Pre-World War One even.
Pre-World War I history books. Having
everything
a really
between
solid
World War One and
understanding
World War II is weird. So go back and read late 19th century stuff.
Yeah, and remember that the role that Canada served in that era was we were colonies of the British, and everybody here
stalwart ally
of the British, and people who lived here considered themselves essentially British citizens. But to some extent, Canadians were second-class British citizens because we didn't enjoy all the privileges and voting rights of being British, but we sure know where the grain was going, you know? And under the British Commonwealth, I think a lot of Canadians who settled here, certainly not First Nations people, but many of the Canadians who settled here did reasonably well. It's nobody would consider early Canadian British citizens to be a particularly exploited or unhappy class. They were actually quite happy with that sense of identity. So I think that we're going to see a return to that way of thinking about the world, except now we're no longer British subjects, we're effectively American ones.
We're de facto American subjects.
We're de facto American subjects, except we have no voting rights. We have very little say in American internal politics, but there will be expectations of maintaining an alliance we can't afford to lose. I don't think we can trust Team Trump or anybody around him to maintain sort of norms of friendship or history here. I think that it's very likely that to the extent that they pay attention to us at all, and if they don't pay any attention to us, that's a good thing, they're going to lever their superior economic power quite ruthlessly to get whatever they want.
It's something I've been thinking about. I haven't even said this to anyone yet, so I'm going to share it just in confidence with you and 25,000 other people. I have never had less interest than spending time in the United States than I do right now. But I've also never been more actively pondering whether it's in my family's strategic interest for us to obtain U.S. citizenship. And that's
good luck. Have you tried navigating our immigration system?
I would have certain advantages, but I'm kind of looking at it with about as much interest as would now be a good time to get this mole removed. But I'm thinking about it.
This is a point that I made in 2020, and I think it still applies today, and actually should have been considered back in 2020. Even if you regarded Trump as a fluke, or even by some delusion you're regarding Trump as a fluke today, you can't disregard the fact that there are factions of America who do legitimately see him as a champion. They weren't going to disappear even if Trump does. Their fundamental relationship to the world is different than their parents' and grandparents' relationship to the world. Their sense of obligation to the world is different than their grandparents' and parents' obligation to the world. Their sense of friendship, their sense of identity, their sense of who are our allies and who are not our allies, who we pay attention to and who we don't. That's all fundamentally different for this Trump era than it was in the Clinton era, Bill Clinton era. We can't make any assumptions of history or friendship here. We just can't operate under the assumption. All of these relationships have to be rebuilt anew, and they'll be rebuilt on new terms that we won't be able to set. So I don't know. Maybe I'm being too fatalistic or too catastrophic.
Oh, no,
maybe.
You know what? Jen, I don't think you are, because I don't think what you've just said is fatalistic. I want people to understand. I'm saying this in reference to the political phrase. I'm not speaking inappropriately to my female co-host here. But what was running through my head when you were saying that was transact, baby, transact. Mm-hmm. It's to your point, hey, we stormed the beaches together at Normandy. That ain't going to cut it anymore.
They're not going to care.
Hey, I got a cousin in Wisconsin. No one gives a shit. It's going to be, this is what we bring to the table, and we're eager to play ball.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting too, because I'm not, like we were saying a minute ago about kind of the role Canada had once played in the international system. You made the point before I could get to it, but it wasn't a bad role.
No.
And it's also not one that I have moral objections to us playing now. I could actually sketch out a version of this that I find ideologically pleasing and probably personally convenient. I've been writing about this for almost 20 years. I have wanted Canada to have a larger role in the Western Alliance out of a mix of a sense of moral obligation, but also such just ruthless pragmatism. I'm not worried about what we're going to have to do. I think what we're going to have to do could be productive and healthy, but it's going to hurt because we left it too late.
Yeah.
Like if we had started down this path, a friend of mine said to me the other day, intended it as reassuring. Some of the people in and around the government have maintained back channel communications with the Trump people.
I would hope so.
Yeah, no, and I was like, great. That is good to know. I'm glad. But what we haven't done is added 3 fucking army brigades in the meantime.
Yeah.
So, like, it's great that they'll still take our calls, but what are we going to say to them when they answer? So, like, it's typical Canadian signaling instead of action.
Instead of doing anything. I mean, look, if you were to ask me specifically what I think is coming down the pipes, I'm looking at tariffs and I'm looking at protectorate taxes. Trump is very fixated, not wrongly, about the fact that Canada in particular undershoots its targets. And even under the reestablished new targets that we've put out, we're still undershooting our agreed upon commitments to NATO. It wouldn't shock me if Trump were to respond to something like that by saying there's an X% of tariffs on everything going in or out of the American-Canadian borders until you guys bring your NATO spending up to agreed upon commitments.
Figure out the dollar value of where
exactly.
we are and where we should be and take it off our imports.
100%.
Yeah.
Something like that is I wouldn't be surprised. I could be wrong. Like I'm just guessing here. I'm blue sky in it here. But there are lots of ways that I can think of Trump screwing us over on everything from energy, ag, what else? I mean, there's tons of things. Telecoms, auto parts, auto trade, pretty much name every single major industry. And
telling the Chinese and the Indians, do what you got to do in Canada, but you set one foot in my country and we bring the wrath of God down on you.
Great. So we become a proxy target for every single diaspora community that wants to take a pot shot at America, but doesn't want to actually piss off America directly. Yep. Super. Great. Love this for
Canada.
us.
Like, we love you guys, but frankly, the Indians are worth more to us in trade. So you're going to have some assassinations.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's not hard for me to see how dark that gets. Also, I mean, from an immigration perspective, increasingly what Canada is setting itself up for is to be a foyer to America, right? Because we have a fairly open, well, until recently, a fairly open immigration policy. So what would tend to happen is that really talented people would come from all around the world, come to Canada, and if they could actually establish credentials and do well and succeed, then they've got a free pass to America. So we become like a sorting bucket for the best, most talented people before they go south. We're a waiting room for America, right? For people who necessarily want. And then we get left with whomever. I'm not saying that the people left behind are untalented or unworthy. Of course, a lot of them are hardworking, excellent individuals. But the brain drain out of the immigration pool is great for America. It's a great system for America. It's not necessarily a great system for us because we have to deal with the economic pressures of taking on more and more people in order to sift through the most talented people for the American system. Great. Super. I mean, this is what we've set ourselves up for. It's
interesting. Saying a minute ago, it's not that I necessarily hate where again, all my feelings on Trump now very much on the record. I don't necessarily hate the kind of Canada we might have to become to live in a Trumpian world. And I still think there are ways we can be true to our older values and do it. Like, we don't have to match U.S. social policy, but we'd better be able to deploy a brigade.
Well,
there's ways we could do this. But
here's the fundamental problem: is that Canada's social policy and its welfare policy was expanded in tandem with our decline in military spending. We literally said, we looked around in the 70s. Said, you know what? There's no way America is going to let anyone invade Canada. It's stupid for us to be spending this much money on the military, and so we slowly let the military decline into its current state of effective incapacity. While we radically expanded the welfare state well beyond anything that any American system has access to. So all of the smug enjoyment that we have of our wonderful healthcare system, our education system, was expanded at the consequence of knowing that America would defend us with their blood and treasure and their significantly reduced welfare state so that we could enjoy ours. I mean, this is like when we talk about Alberta and we whine about equalization payments. One of the whines we get about Alberta is we're spending all this money into Confederation so that Quebec can have a better welfare system than we have at home. That's what we did as a nation over generations, right? We're willing to let America spend their blood and treasure on our defense while we expand so that we can have the benefit of a welfare state that they don't have. That was never sustainable. And I don't care if it was Trump or Vance or any other president. Eventually, somebody was going to call bullshit on that.
Reading my mind again, Jen, because that was my next point. Here's the thing. The Democrats are going to move to where the voters are. Mm-hmm. So there are still going to be differences between Republicans and Democrats, I think, on social issues, domestic social issues. One of the interesting things is that even as Americans broke pretty decisively for the Republicans in this cycle, wherever it was on the ballot, with maybe one or two exceptions, they came out strongly in favor of abortion. So America is still going to have political divides on social issues, but on international and geopolitical defense and trade issues, they will move into alignment.
Yeah, please find me a Democrat who's willing to defend Canadian defense spending. I'll wait.
It's over. Yeah, it's over.
I'll wait.
And it's going to be fascinating to see that. One of the things that's going to happen, and I'm genuinely curious about this, we're going to have to pivot faster than we're used to. And it's a bit of a sloppy analogy, I know, but I honestly don't know if the Canadian government, and to your point before, Jen, particularly the Liberal Party, is going to be able to survive the G-forces that we put on ourselves when we make the kind of maneuvers we're going to need to make now. And I apologize to the viewers and the listeners here. Jen and I are in possession of some inside information about this stuff that we will be able to come out with later. But we have to do a little more actual reporting on it first. But I think I can say, Jen, safely that you and I have a little bit of a glimmer of what the Canadian plans are and a little bit of a glimmer of what the American plans are. And I think the Canadians think they're being ruthless now. Oh, wow, it's time for us to get pragmatic and make difficult decisions. And we're going to do things that'll be painful, but have to be done. They're going to sit down across the table from those American negotiators and bring out their checkers set, and the Americans are going to shove a chessboard at them. The Canadian concept of ruthlessness and the American concept of even mildly benevolent pragmatism is still going to have an awfully wide gap between this. And the hell of the thing is, Jen, the Americans aren't wrong.
No, that's the fundamental problem, is that we have no moral leg to stand on here on some of this stuff.
We did this to ourselves. The Americans did Trump to themselves. Mm-hmm. That's their problem.
Yeah.
What Trump's about to do to us?
Oh, yeah.
That's our problem.
That's our problem. The other thing I would say is, even if I had a full faith in the Liberal brain trust to finally get it, I mean, But you and I aren't talking about stuff that we weren't talking 5 years ago, about 5 years ago. But even if the Liberal Brain Trust finally understands what's happening here, and we have faith in them to understand what's happening here, what's going to happen the second people who are actually in the know start making ruthless calculations and ruthless decisions, and then have to go back to a highly divided, ideologically driven Liberal caucus and justify those decisions? What's going to happen when you've got, people high up in the Liberal Party maintaining their back channels to the Trump crowd in order to stay at the table, and then you've got in public Justin Trudeau running against the second coming of Donald Trump, Pierre Poilievre, in order to try to scare people back into this coalition? I don't mean to be primitive, but the Liberals are uniquely poorly positioned to handle this moment in history. They're uniquely poorly positioned.
Oh God, Jen, you're so right, but it's worse.
Oh, good.
That.
Oh, okay. All
because
right.
First of all, you're right on the positioning. Because oh God, I would love to be in the room when Chrystia Freeland explains to Melanie Joly what has to happen now. That would be fun.
Mm-hmm.
But the other problem is, one of the things the Liberals did this week is they reformed the Cabinet Committee on U.S.-Canadian Relations.
And quite the list it was.
We made this point a little bit in our midweek dispatch. Justin Trudeau is not the prime minister he was in 2016. Chrystia Freeland is not the deputy prime minister. This cabinet is not the cabinet. They're tired. They're exhausted. They have internal problems that are consuming party bandwidth. Donald Trump and his advisors down south, they can read Canadian polling data as well as anyone. They understand that they're dealing with a prime minister who's not quite a lame duck, but isn't that far off. What happens if the Liberals show up in Washington with a checklist of Canadian demands, but also a list of Canadian offerings? And Mr. Trump goes, "Hey guys, great to see you. How you doing? Yeah, we're pretty busy right now. We don't think we can get you in for about 12 months. That's okay. We'll deal with the next guy."
Well, the other thing I would also point out is, and again, this is one of those things where I'm trying to carefully say things that I suspect and or know without necessarily saying things that I suspect and or know. It's great that there are people in the Liberal space who believe that they've maintained back channels to Trump people, and maybe they have. I can't say for certain that they haven't. But I can't help but observe that when I see things like Canadian delegations down in the States, I see pictures with a lot of people who don't matter.
Oh, especially the Americans.
No, I see high-level Canadian people doing delegations in the United States, and the people they're meeting with are not players, and they don't even know who's a player or not a player. They're taking meetings with people who are underling of the underling, and they're not informed enough to know that they're not in the room. They're not even informed enough to know that they're not in the room.
You know what's funny?
So I don't necessarily trust Liberals when they quietly assure us that, oh yeah, no, we've maintained back channels. I don't trust that they actually have enough understanding of who matters in that world to know whether or not they're actually maintaining the connections that they need to be maintaining. There's some. I have questions about that. I'll leave it there.
Wayne Gretzky, the great one, was, you're mostly off Twitter. God bless you.
Yes.
Scandalette du jour was that Wayne Gretzky and his wife, Janet, an American-born wife, were at one of the Trump celebratory parties. And I think it was Chris Selly. I don't remember who it was, but someone observed every couple of years, Canadians are reminded that Wayne Gretzky is politically conservative, and they fucking freak out, but then they forget. And then a few years later, he goes to another fundraiser and we're reminded all over again. So I'm looking at all these Canadians who are angry at the great one for liking Trump. Counterpoint, thank fucking God Because we can call Wayne and say, Wayne, your country needs you. Like, Canadian defense and security policy may rest on Wayne Gretzky's ability to get some FaceTime with the president-elect and do us a favor. And we were talking a little bit. I said to you jokingly a minute ago, like, I'd love to see Chrystia Freeland explaining this to Melanie Jolie.
How seriously do you think the Americans take Melanie Jolie? How seriously do you think anyone in the American-Canadian diplomatic milieu takes Melanie Jolie? You think she's highly regarded? You think she gets
Jen, I'm going to answer this question in a strange way. It's a lot safer for you to say the answer to that than it is for me. When
I mean, like Chrystia Freeland, and I think Chrystia Freeland's got more brains than most of them, okay? I think she actually does get it. I do.
I think she gets it.
I think she gets it. But she was lauded in Canada as the hero of UMSCA. She came home the triumphing heroes as having nailed UMSCA. Do you think that that's how she was regarded in the States?
No.
Do you think that perhaps our perception of the influence that we have in Trump land might be the reflection of Canadian self-involvement and perhaps not an objective and grounded assessment?
I'm hitting the
where we are?
knees to offer prayers of thanks to Wayne Gretzky for a reason. Here's a fun question for you. Even though it has crumbled a little bit, what is Justin Trudeau's last demographic bastion of electoral support?
Boomers.
Which kind of boomer in particular?
Wealthy boomers in urban areas.
I mean, in a more basic analysis.
Oh.
You or me?
You.
No, you. Women.
Oh, women. Sure. Okay.
Boomer women.
Boomer women.
Hypothetically, just throwing some spaghetti at the wall here. Which segment of the Canadian electorate do you think is going to react most badly to the new triple the size of the Canadian Army plan?
Well, I don't want to reduce it just to defense policy because I think it's deeper than defense policy. I think it's
going to be boomer women who hate the adjustments most.
Yeah, and I think that the idea that we're going to have to run lockstep with the Americans on pretty much all of our diplomatic policies from here on in, that's also not going to go over great with boomer women.
I was talking this week with a friend. I don't want to burn personal confidences here. But he had mentioned that, as Samara said before, like, everybody has their Trump. Yeah, it's bad that he does this, but it's great he's going to do that. I have a friend who's pretty confident that Trump's worth it because he's going to stop woke in the schools and the indoctrination of the young.
Okay, great.
If you look at the demographic breakdown, particularly of American data, but you start to see signs of it in Canadian data as well. You want to know who's shockingly right-wing?
Tell me.
The very young.
Oh, yeah. There's been a really interesting demographic shift on that stuff.
Completely inverting the usual pyramid. Now, they're still lazy and they don't vote much. But if you actually pull them, I haven't seen yet reliable data from the United States that shows me how voters, say, 18 to 25 voted. But if you look at any Canadian public opinion polling, look at that youngest cohort of voters. The Conservatives are way ahead. So I don't know if these guys are still going to be delighted when we have to conscript a bunch of them. But the ones who are going to be the most shocked, like by those G-forces, the whiplash of the changes that are going to be coming, it's going to be boomers, particularly boomer women, which means that Justin Trudeau is going to have to do things almost literally with a gun to our head, economically speaking, that are going to be the most unpalatable to, I would say, two blocks of Canadian voters: boomer women and the average Quebecer. Okay.
I'm just also going to point out that maybe if you are Trudeau, or if you're a Liberal generally, this might be the moment to pull the plug. I think a lot of these guys went into this election thinking that if Trump won, that was going to be great for them, that they were going to be able to mobilize.
Dispatch, right? Completely wrong-headed.
I think it's, put it this way, these guys, I think a lot of these guys still think that they're running against Donald Trump without realizing that they're Kamala Harris. I do get the sense that the optimism that they were running against Trump, and that this was going to be great for them in their fight, in their petty little fight against Pierre Poilievre, is now hitting up against a wall of real reality for what that means for Canada, and just what they might be, the slog they might be looking at if they get reelected, and how difficult that's going to be, particularly for them. There's got to be some faction within the Liberal Party that's going, you know what? It's time to go. We're not better or best equipped for this ideologically. Our base isn't properly equipped for what we need to do here.
We're politically weak.
We're politically weak. We're internally weak. We can't get it together. Justin Trudeau is going to be, in particular, a target for Donald Trump, because he's going to make a point of emasculating and undermining Justin Trudeau, because Justin Trudeau is hated among Trump's base. He's become like this.
Well, they've kept the
pinata
list of every time Trudeau or some Liberal minister has.
Yeah. So this is just, it's a really good moment to reconsider whether or not it makes sense for the good of the country to be having a Liberal government right now. And maybe it's time to pull the plug. There has to be some informed faction of the Liberal caucus that is not so delusional that they realize that.
Oh, must there be?
Must there be?
You know, I don't know if you've read your Globe and Mail this morning, but God, I'm forgetting who it was. The last time I winged this, I screwed up which Globe columnist it is, so I'm gun shy now. I think it was Doug Saunders, but in a kind of a what it all means, one of the things he said was that any Western country that currently has an unstable electoral situation should immediately have an election. And the two he identified, if I'm correct about it being Doug Saunders, the two that Doug identified immediately were Canada and Germany.
He's right on both fronts.
Yeah.
And Canada is not well. Yeah. So we've got till January for inauguration. It behooves us extraordinary. It behooves the nation to ensure that whatever government we're going to be dealing with for the next 4 years is in place and stably asserted by inauguration.
Can I be naughty just for a second?
Go for it.
Cheeky?
Be cheeky.
I agree with everything you're saying, but I want to put this in terms that Liberals might find more palatable than get out of the way because you're helpless and obsolete.
Okay.
It's a tough message to swallow. So let me mix a little sugar in with the medicine. Call an election now, lose, and watch Pierre Poilievre be the guy doing all of this.
Absolutely.
And then come back in 4 years. Because in 4 years, Trump will be done one way or the other, we assume.
Well, we assume. We assume.
Come back in 4 years. Look at the wreckage of the Canadian economy and our once great social services as the newly conscripted high school students parade down the street on the way to the regimental mustering stations and go,
oh, it's so dark.
You want to reward the Conservatives 4 more years of this?
It's not wrong.
I don't think they will, but I could make a case for them that their best move is to lose an election immediately.
Look, the best time for them to have dropped the writ was in September. The second best time is right now.
Right now.
Get it done. I don't think we have anything else to say about this. I do think we want to wrap up with Amsterdam. We've been rambling on darkly, and maybe too darkly. Maybe we're overestimating how dark this is going to get. Maybe we're wrong. I don't know. No one can predict the future. But I do think that regardless of whether or not we're right or wrong, you should like and subscribe and check us out at www.readtheline. And when we get back, we're going to talk about what's going on in Amsterdam and why that has us even more scared.
Well, because we haven't bombed everyone out enough. We're really going to go for broke. Jen, you've spent some time in Israel, and as you've noted, a little busy right now, so you haven't published your big opus on your experience there. But on late in the evening, Thursday local time in Europe, which was earlier in the evening for us in North America, and then into the overnight hours, there was a significant security incident in Amsterdam. And at this time, I'm a little reluctant to get into huge specifics because there's a lot we don't know. Mm-hmm. But the big picture is that an Israeli soccer team was in Amsterdam and fans were there. And there had been some soccer hooliganism. Apparently, not every Israeli fan was behaving. Apparently, there'd been some bigoted chants. There'd been some vandalism. That's obviously unacceptable.
But pretty normal within the boundary of European soccer culture.
Hooliganism.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and fuck those guys on general principles, but.
Yeah, but this is not abnormal.
The next night, as some Israelis were leaving the venue at multiple locations, according to reports, they were attacked by mobs that appear to have been organized. And there were cries, apparently, again, witness report saying that there were cries during the violence where some people were beaten that were targeting Israelis or just simply Jews. And the security forces in Amsterdam were caught with their pants down completely. They were not prepared for this, despite having every reason to have been prepared. It took hours to get organized, where Israelis and Jews hid in local businesses or hotels. It was a pogrom in Amsterdam. Thank God no one was killed, but there were some injuries.
So here's the first thing. The word pogrom, coming back into fashion, I think needs to be properly understood.
That's a data point.
It's a data point, but I think it needs to be properly understood in a historical context. What a pogrom was in particularly Eastern European history prior to the Holocaust were periodic outbreaks of anti-Jewish violence that were either tacitly permitted by the state or tacitly encouraged by the state, which led to horrific violence targeting specifically Jewish communities. These were often done in the open, without shame. The people who engaged in them engaged in terrible violence in front of newspaper reporters. These things are very well documented. And they show up on a semi-regular basis throughout pre-Second World War II history. The history of anti-Jewish pogroms became the basis for creating and establishing a Zionist movement, which led to the return to Israel of many European Jews, not just after the war, but prior to the war. For many years, in some cases prior to the war, there are now Jews living in Israel who have traced ancestry back to ancient times, but there are also people who trace ancestry back hundreds of years, not dozens.
They got tired of the farm in Poland being looted every few years.
Well, exactly, that's right. So a pogrom has a very specific meaning in a very specific context, and I think that you and I are of a generation where we thought we would never actually see them. These were figments and fragments of a long lost history. So, is what we're seeing in Amsterdam qualify as a pogrom? I think that the answer tentatively is probably yes. Certainly, these are not, thank God, as violent as previous pogroms have been in the past. Previous would see and witness pretty routinely thousands of Jewish people dead.
No confirmed rapes or murders in this one, so we're off to a good start.
Yeah, so this is not as bad as a historical one would have been. But the fact that we're now debating degree of pogrom is not great. That's not a great data point. The reason why I think this is particularly important is that in Canada, we've witnessed pro-Palestinian protests that go well beyond established norms for protests. I mean, I am a free speech fanatic. I'm a big believer in the right of people to assemble and protest. However, it's one thing to assemble and protest in front of the Parliament of Canada or, say, in front of the Israeli embassy. And it's another thing to take over a known Jewish neighborhood in Toronto, screaming about the Intifada. You're now well over the line, as far as I can tell, and particularly when you consider the historical context for that. And we know that particularly in places like Toronto and Montreal, the police have taken a very, we're not going to crack heads. We're
here to keep the peace.
We're here to keep the peace. We're here to try and minimize escalation. There have even been, I know, Jewish people who have been told, don't go around flagging your Israeli flag in the face of pro-Palestinian protesters. You're provoking them. So there's been a real policy of, we're just going to keep the peace between these two diaspora communities, and we're not going to raise tensions. And I can understand that in the Canadian context, but what I think that Canadian context is not taking into consideration is the historical one. When you allow anti-Semitic, so this goes beyond protests, when you allow anti-Semitic demonstrations to continue to escalate, or you enable them, or you don't demonstrate clear and established boundaries, the historical context for that is that it escalates to violence. And I think that what's happening in Amsterdam really ought to be a wake-up call for a lot of municipal police forces in Canada that some norms and boundaries need to be reestablished and reaffirmed. Like I said, I don't think that we should be going in there and cracking heads against pro-Palestinian protesters. I don't hold to that. But I do think that some expectations need to be established with these protesters about where some lines are. And as I said, protesting in front of embassies, protesting in front of civic buildings, it's fine. That's acceptable. Calling for violence against your neighbors is not. Taking over the local Jewish synagogue, that is not acceptable. I don't think that's acceptable. I don't think that's covered within any boundaries of ordinary standards of free speech and protest. And I worry that the historic and the recent historic unwillingness of police forces to establish reasonable boundaries around some of this stuff risks giving many of these protesters the tacit understanding that escalation will be more or less ignored.
While you were gone, there was a fight, brawl, whatever, I don't know what we want to call it, outside a Hindu temple. Mm-hmm. In the GTA in Brampton, Greater Toronto area, to my northwest, a suburb of Toronto with a significant Indian subcontinent diaspora of obviously a religious mix. Certainly in recent weeks, Jen, you and I have spoken about the interest India, including its intelligence services, has in Canada. The Indian diaspora in Canada is an active front for Indians politically and in their own view as a matter of national security. A lot of age-old hatreds and animosities, and they broke out into violence outside a religious site in this country. Mm-hmm. And I'm with you, Jen. I don't want heads cracked. I don't want water cannons. I don't want mounted police units taking charges into crowds. But it's time to put a lid on this. And I don't know how we do that. If someone has a proposal to do it in a way that involves no cavalry charges, cracked heads, and water cannons, I'm extremely fucking open-minded to that proposal.
How about we just establish some pretty clear no protest zones in Jewish communities, community centers, and neighborhoods and synagogues? I don't think
Do we arrest anyone who violates it?
Yes, I do think that you have to, if you're going to establish those kinds of boundaries, then you do have to risk arrest. I think that it is reasonable.
Do we immediately put them out on bail?
Well,
and then do we plead out their charges 45 days later for a fine?
Essentially, that's historically how we disperse protest, yes. But look, the answer has to be more than do nothing. Look, if we look at the history of anti-Semitism in the world, I think that people who are Jewish have a particular case to say, look, we're particularly concerned when we start seeing synagogues getting firebombed, thank you. I think that concern is legitimate and justified. I think some special consideration for the minority status and the history of Jews needs to be put into consideration here when policing decisions are made. And I think that if you don't, the risk of escalation to violence is very high. That's all I think. Now,
I'm worried about the same things you are, but I'm also worried about something else. State capacity.
Sure.
State willingness.
Sure.
Do we have the ability to take a more muscular posture on matters of public safety? I'm not telling you it ain't warranted. Do we have the cops? Are the cops going to be willing to do it? Will their public service associations agree with it?
Well,
or do we have a correctional system that can handle this? If we find out that anyone involved in this, and again, I'm not just limiting this to Jewish targets. Like, again, if there's another incident outside of a Hindu temple,
sure.
And if we find out some of the participants who have violated Canadian law are here on a student visa or any other temporary migration path, does our immigration bureaucracy have the ability to remove these people from the country on an expedited basis and never let them back in?
I'm saying in the absence of state capacity, people rarely
arm up and do it themselves.
That's right.
And it's happening already.
So police, this is what I would say to you. If you don't make a decision here, people are going to make decisions around you. I don't think that that's a good outcome for the country.
And I think I agree with Jen, and I'm going to echo this. I'm glad we're sending this message directly to the police, and I 100% echo this. If you are a member of law enforcement, I want you to remember what we're saying here. I want you to tell your friends. I want you to tell your commanders. If you have a friend or a loved one who's a member of law enforcement, I want you to tell them this too. But what we're also telling you is we're talking directly to the cops for a very simple reason. We've given up on the politicians. They're going to tweet. They're going to tell you, they're going to say, this isn't who we are. This doesn't reflect our values. That's the maximum help you're going to get for this. Cops, I am sorry, guys. You're on your own. Fix it yourself, or people are going to start hanging out in their synagogues overnight with shotguns.
Well, and historically, again, go look at what's happened in history. Not even that long ago, to communities that were repeatedly targeted with this kind of violence. And that's where this goes. Again, the history is right there for anybody who wants to read it.
Religious or tribal or even territorial defense groups.
And I said it's not even necessarily even just Jewish people who feel threatened, rightfully so, and who feel that the police aren't taking these concerns seriously. It's any community. As Matt and I have spoken about in the past, white waspy communities in Northern Toronto are now hiring their own security forces. In Toronto, this is happening. Like, you go talk to any gun, police know this. You have to know this. Go talk to any gun owner in any city in Canada, and they're going to tell you guns have been flying off the shelves.
Still can't find 410 shotgun shells.
Why is that happening?
People are going to be shocked how quickly we can rewind social progress. What takes 100 years to make can be unwound
in a year,
in much less than 100 years.
Yeah. But anyway, on that happy note, I think we got to say like and subscribe to the line. Great podcast. So cheerful, so upbeat, so hopeful.
You know what? Honestly, Jen, I know you got to run, you got an appointment, but let me just make this point in 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
I still think Canada and Canadians can thrive. Jen, you and I are going to thrive. We're going to be okay. But we're going to have to be consciously okay. We're going to have to work at being okay. The era of, wow, I was born in Canada, how bad can it get, is over. The era of, I'm glad I was born in Canada, a country that provides enough solid fundamentals for me to make conscious decisions that allow me to be okay, is beginning. Like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe.
Today's podcast was brought to you by Unsmoke Canada. Now is the time to modernize Canadian laws so that adult smokers have information and access to better alternatives. By doing so, we can create lasting change. Learn more at unsmoke.ca.